This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of Pink Talks, a platform by Young Educators Europe, which advocates for social equality and feminism. I'll introduce myself. My name is Tiziana Ruberto, and I'm hosting today this episode together with my colleague here with me.
Hello, I'm Catarina.
So today we will be talking about sexual harassment in the workplace and the impact of the Me Too movement internationally. And we will be doing this with our guest, Dr. Christina Julios. Christina is an author, a researcher, a gender equalities and women's violence expert. So Christina, welcome to Pink Talks, and great to have you here today. Christina has recently published a book about sexual harassment in the UK Parliament, and she identified ways to redress the status quo and changes ahead, including a gender power gap, use of non-disclosure agreements to silence victims, and organizational culture. Christina, you have the chance today to tell a bit about your book, what is the book about, and what have been your main findings so far. Can you tell us something a bit more in detail?
Yes, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Tiziana. Thank you, Anna, and yeah, I hope I can give you some indication as to the type of research that I've been doing. I'll start with the book. So a bit of a commercial plug. The book is titled, as you can see there, "Sexual Harassment in the UK Parliament: Lessons from the Me Too Era." And it has just been published in February, barely 3 months, by Palgrave Macmillan. And it's the first study of its kind, and it looks at the phenomenon of sexual harassment, obviously in the UK Parliament, and in politics in the UK, but also highlights the situation of women in the workplace, in the wider workplace. So it also looks at some issues to do with gender inequality, misogynistic attitudes, lack of representation of women, and so forth. Now, the book is put in the context of the Me Too movement. So it starts to look at developments in terms of sexual harassment in the UK Parliament from 2017 onwards, which is when we have the rise, as it were, of the online Me Too movement. And of course, we're familiar with the Hollywood sex scandal and so forth. We've seen this translated into the UK Parliament from 2017 onwards, when we started to see headlines like the ones we already seen these days, with parliamentarians being accused, MPs being accused of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, all sorts of misconduct. And the book really focuses on the experiences of women working in not only in Parliament, but in the labour market at large. And it's important because the theme is about sexual harassment, and women are, of course, still overrepresented as victims of sexual harassment. They overwhelmingly are the victims, and sexual harassment still, although of course it affects men, women, people from all sorts of sexual orientations and demographics, but yet in terms of female-male ratio, the vast majority of perpetrators are male, and the females are the victims. And certainly in Parliament, this has been the case. So just very briefly, the book looks at the issues in terms of organizational cultures, the lack of support for victims, the problems they experience versus the perpetrators, which typically have been MPs, and the dynamics in the workplace. And the fact that this is an endemic problem, not only in the UK, but in workplaces everywhere. And this is what the Me Too movement helped to highlight, that this is endemic everywhere, pretty much. So there's plenty of evidence, case studies, voices from victims, but also the book looks at solutions. What can we do? And of course, it looks at the whole policy development in the UK, legislation, but also practical solutions and practical initiatives that organizations can take, in particular policies and procedures, HR, for instance, which is pretty abysmal in many places when it comes to sexual harassment. And finally, the fact that it's reporting rates are very low, so many of the victims are discouraged from reporting cases. And also, interestingly, the book touches on NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. These are gagging orders that employers sign with employees, which are perfectly legal, but they can be used unethically. And this is what, again, the book highlights, the unethical use of non-disclosure agreements to hide sexual harassment and misconduct in the workplace. So I hope that's enough to start with the conversation.
Absolutely. Erin, thanks for this very clear introduction. I have to say, you mentioned some of the key words, in my opinion. I really want to have a look at more in details. For example, workplace, HR policies, NDAs, reporting rates, which are very, very low. So just let's go in order. In your opinion, because you mentioned the workplace, happening in the workplace, so I feel like they used to be in the past, or something has changed, at least slightly. We're always talking about modern times and women in powers and etc., 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 etc. But my perception is, and also according to what you just said, that things haven't changed so much, haven't changed so massively as they should have been. So, what's your idea? What's your thought on this point?
I think that there has been progress, and progress has been made at many levels, if only because we have more women now at work and also educated women in positions of authority. But yet the gender gap and the gender power gap in organizations still remains very much skewed towards men. And we can look at lack of representation of women in parliament, for instance. In the UK, we have 35% of female representation in the House of Commons. We have 28% in the House of Lords. And if you look at these figures, you extrapolate it globally. The World Economic Forum has looked at data from 156 countries, and they found that only about 26% of female representation in parliaments around the world. So it's still very low. We have 81 countries.
Sorry, Christina, 50%?
No, 26%. 26%. The World Economic Forum, they have data from 156 countries. And out of this, what they found is that on average, it's about 26% of female representation in parliaments. But also we have 81 countries which have never had heads of states which are female. We only have 10 female acting heads of state currently. So again, very low representation of women in positions of authority and in parliament in particular. And therefore, you have almost a perfect storm, don't you? You have a position in which women are less in parliament, about a third of females, and therefore it's a very masculine, male-dominated environment. And women are in positions they not only are outnumbered, but they are outranked, because in positions of authority, ministers, officials within parliament, civil servants, top-level civil servants, again, you find that mostly male. And therefore, while attitudes have evolved, they have improved, we have better awareness and better data in terms of what we know. But fundamentally, the gender power gap hasn't evolved in that way. And just to give you, again, a sense, the World Economic Forum suggests that at the current rate of progress, it would take about 145 years to close the gender gap when it comes to gender parity in politics. So that gives you a sense of, yes, progress is being made, but the fundamentals remain, and it's a long way to go.
Can I ask you a question?
145 years, yes. Yeah.
About the gender gap, what were the policies, namely in the UK, that were implemented to reduce the power gap? Because I know that in some countries, in Portugal, for example, we have like quotas that have to be fulfilled with women in parliament. So in the UK, it's the same.
We don't have quotas. There's been a lot of debate about this, but the feeling was that that we shouldn't be, or rather, the government should not be deterministic in terms of quota. In Norway, for instance, they have quotas, and they have about 45% representation in parliament or something like that. So they make it legal to have at least a number of women at the table. In the UK, what we have is targets, shall we say, and we are now on the again around the 30%, and there is something called the 30% club, which is women's in sort of like for the business sector that aims to have women on boards of companies, at least 30% of women on boards. And there's been a lot of debate about this because some argue that this is aiming too low. Why 30%? Why not 50%? Why not parity? But progress keeps being made. There is also data that suggests that we plateau in terms of how women are being put in boards of companies. Because of course, for somebody to get in a board of a company, somebody needs to go. So the process is very slow. And again, when you look at organizational structures, it is a very clear pyramid where you see time and time again organizations where at the top end of the echelon, there are very few women, and the majority are men. And even in organizations such as the NHS, which has something like 70% female workforce, but 89% of females in the NHS are nurses. So if you go to look at doctors, you're going to find about 30% of doctors. If you go to chief executives, then maybe again you find figures which are lower. So it's interesting when you look at the data and the certainly labor market segregation in terms of jobs, gender, and of course think about ethnicity, think about disability, all sorts of other demographic factors that influence somebody's position in an organization and in the labor market at large.
Tiziana, I interrupted you. Sorry, you were making ready to make a question.
No, no. Yeah, well, I have other questions, yes, but no worries, Anna. That's something fine. I was just astonished by that number mentioned by Christina, 150 years to close this gap. I mean, that's unbelievable. So going back to sexual harassment in the workplace, Christina, you mentioned at some point some HR new policies which might be introduced or have been introduced. So what type of initiatives are you aware of that you can tell us about?
Yes,
which are already in place. I mean,
right. So in terms of sexual harassment, there's a couple of first of all, there's been a lot of public policy, lots of reports from the House of Commons Women's and Equalities Commission. We have the late Dame Laura Cox report into the bullying and harassment of House of Commons staff. We have lots of different parliamentary initiatives because the deluge of it was an avalanche of in 2017-18 of media headlines in terms of MPs. It really was something extraordinary, and doing the research was fascinating, but yet at the same time you just could not believe the sheer amount of misconduct that came to light and the victims' stories. So the government went into overdrive, as it were, and from 2018 onwards, we've seen a lot of different initiatives. But perhaps one of the most relevant ones is the establishment of an independence, complaints, and grievance scheme. And let me explain this. Prior to the Me Too movement and the whole impact that it had in Parliament, if somebody was making a complaint this would be typically somebody who was being perhaps sexually harassed by their boss. And typically this would be, for example, a parliamentary assistant or a researcher or an administrator or a campaigner being harassed either by an MP, by a civil servant, or by somebody in a position of authority. So if they wanted to complain, Parliament would investigate these complaints internally. So you can see the difficulties there for anybody who finds themselves in that position, particularly if they're early in their careers and they want to get on in politics, to make a complaint about the MP who is your boss. And this is the stories, as I say, that come all the time. So you could do that, and you could initiate internal complaints procedures. Now, you can already see the difficulties of anybody doing that if you want to get on in politics or in your career in parliament. It may be intrusive, it may be a lengthy process, it may re-traumatize a person who has been assaulted, for example. And of course, one of the things that came up, and certainly in Dame Laura Cox's report, it was the complicity of organizations and structures within parliaments that they tend to cover up to help the powerful as opposed to those making the complaints. So after the Me Too...
Sorry to interrupt, Christina, because I'm very curious about this aspect. Why do you think that it's like organizations behind tend to cover up? So what is that? Because they to cover up the shame, because they want to protect themselves somehow, because they want to avoid the scandal to become public. What's the main reason? Normally, usually,
all of those reasons. Organizations don't like bad publicity. Organizations don't like to show that their staff are being abused, are being sexually harassed, and they're doing nothing about it. So they will cover up because bureaucracies, organizations tend to be very reactionary. They protect themselves. Also, remember that they are staffed by people whose best is in their best interest to protect the organization. And often, again, when you look at the statements from the victims, they might say, well, actually, this was somebody from HR who knew the MP who was actually helping them to do something else with somebody else. So, you get this situation in which organizations collude in this complicity. And this is one of the findings from the Dame Laura Cox report. She talked about lack of support available to victims, a culture of complicity, lack of protection for individuals, lack of accountability in terms of perpetrators. So organizations tend to be complicit in this culture of covering up the kind of misconduct because it doesn't look good on them. And just to give you some figures,
so sorry. So not only don't they just cover up. They not only cover up the issue, but they also don't take any sort of measure. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example, and you may recall the case of Bex Bailey. Bex Bailey was a Labour Party activist, and she, in the wake of the Me Too, she was one of the first ones in the UK who actually disclosed that she had been raped at a Labour Party conference. This was a historical allegation of rape, which had happened many years ago. But with the Me Too movement and this perhaps emphasis and encouragement for people to come to go public and to talk about their stories, she disclosed this. At the time, she said that she told officials what happened to her, and she was discouraged from reporting the incident, not only to the party, but to the police, and to do anything about it. And this happened many years ago. So she lived with that, working in parliament, working for the Labour Party, but officials themselves within the party told her not to say anything, and she remained silent for many years. And her story has been repeated so many times. So it's this idea of collusion, of a conspiracy of silence. It's not good publicity for organizations to disclose this kind of situation. And that's where, so we have lots of different reports and research done in parliament and in independent bodies looking at this. But the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme was set up after the whole Me Too movement, and to become independent, so to give victims an opportunity to have their complaints and the allegations, remember that these are allegations, investigated independently from Parliament. So that's a real step in the right direction. And just to give you a sense, last year their helpline received 388 people who complained, who called the helpline about some kind of sexual harassment or misconduct. And of all of those, only 48 investigations were completed, and only 46% were upheld. So again, it gives you a sense of the volume of complaints, but ultimately how they are ultimately whittled down to very few cases. And this is a huge problem because not only people do not complain, they do not report, and even those who report, the cases who succeed are tiny. And this is a huge problem in terms of convictions. Yeah.
That was one of my question is the women that come forward with these allegations, um, do they receive some kind of backlash because of that, because of the complaints that they are doing? Are there any data on that?
Oh, well, I think that's a really interesting question in terms of data, because the data is, of course, imperfect, flawed. We only have underestimates. We only have often, apart from some of the surveys and independent studies that have been done, what we know is that something like a third of people in the labor market, not just in parliament, have experienced some kind of sexual harassment or misconduct. And this is from the Government Equalities Office, who did a survey on sexual harassment. 72% of people in the population have already experienced some kind of sexual harassment. It's huge. It's really endemic. Now, of those who complained, there are huge pressures on them not to complain, but also to perhaps settle down quietly. So that's where the NDAs come into. Many women, and this is the idea of the fear factor, they are afraid of complaining because of, yes, a backlash from others, perhaps in the organization. If you are complaining about an MP, it's not in the best interest of the party that the MP's name is going to be in the newspapers, as we've seen, that perhaps they're going to have to investigate them, they're going to have to suspend them while an investigation takes place. It's not a good look for the party. And therefore, they are encouraged to either remain silent and not to complain, or simply to sign the NDAs agreement, just to literally to be paid for their silence. So that's part of the problem, because obviously, as I say, it's not good publicity for any organization to show that indeed this is happening.
So basically, women nowadays are still struggling to report these harassment cases because they know or they feel that they might be misjudged, that might be judged negatively, that might be taken seriously.
Yes, and I can just literally review a list of I made of the, and this is again from all the different reports and research that has been done into this. And female victims don't report because of fear of not being taken seriously, or not being believed, or losing their jobs, of potential damage to their reputations, of jeopardizing their future careers, because they don't have faith in the system. They don't believe that even if they report, this is going to go anywhere. They also have lack of access to organizational systems. For instance, proper, robust HR systems. Bex Bailey, again, she complained eventually, and she was very critical of the party system and the parliamentary system that would take so long for her complaints to be heard. And she faced a backlash because of this, and also lack of resources. If the parliamentary procedures, HR, is not working, women still have any victim of sexual harassment or misconduct at work. They always have the option of seeking justice through the courts, and of course that is very, very, very costly, and in terms of time and money. So the odds are stacked against victims of sexual harassment at work. And again, there is evidence to show that many of them either remain silent or they leave their jobs. And again, in the book, we have lots of accounts of women who just left. They haven't spoken because they thought, if you're starting your career in politics, that's not a good start. Accusing your MP boss of sexual harassment. So they just try to get by the best they can. And if that doesn't work, they leave their jobs. In comparison,
so to protect ourselves. Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry. I was going to say that in comparison, what we found, and certainly in terms of the research of the book, is for the MPs, typically the MPs who were the perpetrators in these cases, they either would issue a public apology. So you see the two routes of the victim who ends up being silent, or just literally leaving the job. And the MP is the perpetrator. So they would typically either issue an apology, they could be reprimanded by the party, and all of these things that I'm mentioning were illustrated and evidenced in the book and in the research. Some of them underwent internal investigations, and again, this also extrapolates to the labor market in general. Some MPs were temporarily suspended while there was an investigation, and in very rare cases, they stepped down if it was too embarrassing or if it was too great. Say there is, for example, a case of a rape or a sexual assault, but ultimately they remain as MPs. So they have, in a sense, you could argue they got away with it. Whereas for the women who are the victims, the situation is completely different.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Well, that's unbelievable. So what to say, it's basically up to us to protect ourselves because the system, the society doesn't do that. Are there any measures in particular that we can adopt to prevent becoming victims of that you can suggest?
Yes, it all comes down to policies and procedures. I mean, a couple of things. First of all, narrowing the gender gap. We need to ensure that we have a parity in the labor market because that is going to be far more conducive to women-friendly and a more diverse workforce. Again, think about minority ethnic groups, think about disability groups, demographic groups which are consistently left out, disadvantaged, discriminated. And we need more diversity, and we need more women in positions of authority because that helps. Parliament is not a very family-friendly profession or place to work. Very long hours, the over-socialization of the staff, a culture of drinking, all the bars, all this kind of thing. And it's very conducive precisely to this kind of situation that we see with the sexual harassment of mostly females, but also workers in parliaments. There are there is the issue of the gender power gap that needs to be redressed. Then we have organizational cultures. We still have a very entrenched misogynistic culture in many organizations, even the legal profession, even the business sector, the NGOs, in many organizations. And again, the book illustrates many examples of different organizations in which still very much the role of women is being seen as supportive rather than an equal partner, and where accusations and allegations of sexual harassment, they are covered up time and time again. So we need to change the culture of the organizations and the way in which they work to allow, for instance, working mothers to have a political career or a career. So that is important. And then, of course, to change the organizational structures that perpetuates this situation. And this comes really, really clearly in the research of the book and in all of the different reports, that the organizational structure, HR, for example, even the advisors, some of the women are being given, just keep quiet and, hope for the best type of thing. So there is a whole host of different things that need to happen. We have decades of legislation on equality, but yet it's how we ultimately implement that in the labor market. And can I just make one comment as well, which has become important. And this is the impact that the pandemic has had on women's equality and their position in the labor market, because it has rolled back many of the gains that women have achieved over the years, because they found themselves at home taking care of children. And therefore that has to be taken into consideration as well, the impact that this has had it hasn't helped really many women, but yet that's another layer.
What type of impact are you talking about? What type of impact that the pandemic had
with the pandemic? Because many women have had to stay at home working, and many women have therefore become their possibility to go out and work has diminished, and many have taken on again domestic responsibilities. because the pandemic has forced them into retrieving into the domestic sphere. And again, there's plenty of examples and evidence to looking at this. Another aside to all this is the issue of domestic violence, for instance, which has there's been a whole rise in women, calling helplines and refuges and all sorts during the pandemic. So again, think about the environment in which we're living, which has not helped to move forward, women's rights in unemployment rights for women in the workplace.
Can I ask you another question? Do you think that in this case, with the MPs case of harassment, and they are not held accountable for their actions, that this somehow legitimizes these kinds of behaviors? It normalizes this kind of behaviors, and I don't know. It's something that's because they are men with power. They are seen in the media, in social media. They supposedly are leaders. So that's
Yes, yes, absolutely, and this is a real problem because it's all about attitudes. Now, when we look, for instance, at sexual harassment, we do have legal definitions of sexual harassment, and we have all sorts of legal instruments that define what sexual harassment is. Now, the problem with sexual harassment, like many sexual offenses, is that often there are different interpretations of what sexual harassment means. Did somebody look at you in a certain way, perhaps a touch or something, it was more than you thought, or maybe it wasn't. And so you have, and again, in the book, this comes very clearly, the versions of events by the victims and the versions of events by the perpetrators. And surprise, surprise, they're very different. So in the case of the UK Parliament and the MPs, the vast majority of the ones that are reported, and certainly in the book, they did not acknowledge any wrongdoing. So they felt that what they did, it was not sexual harassment, but it was just banter. It was just a joke. It was just, guys, playing a joke in the office or whatever it was. But it was never any wrongdoing. It was really interesting, even in cases where they acknowledged that they, for instance, Mark Garnier, he asked his Caroline Edmonton, so his secretary, to go to Soho and buy for him sex toys. I mean, this was in the media, in the press, but he never acknowledged that this was. He said, yes, of course, this happened, but this was just, a joke, banter, big deal. This was no sexual harassment. So he didn't see that as sexual harassment. We have, MPs who have, again, touched somebody's knees or make a pass at somebody, and again, they don't see that as sexual harassment. They see that just as, again, as a joke. And so attitudes are quite interesting to see how people perceive and see what they do and their actions. So if not only they don't consider they're doing anything wrong, but then nothing happens really apart from an apology, that only reinforces that it's okay to do that. It's fair game because that's what it is. So indeed, it's a whole issue of accountability. And of course, when you hear the victims' statements, that time and time again, they feel let down. They feel that the other people, the perpetrators got away with this. But at the same time, they feel, well, they're just cutting their losses. At least, they get on with their lives. But obviously, that's not right because people need to be held accountable. So yes, in terms of attitudes, very interesting actually, how people view what took place. And that goes back to the data, and that's what is so flawed when it comes to this type of interactions, because it's somebody's version of events versus somebody else's. He said, she says. So who do we believe? What happened? Well, discuss. And it's a real problem. Yes.
Yeah, it is indeed. Yeah. So you mentioned cultural change. There's a lot of hard work to do from a cultural perspective, and I agree with this statement really. Say that the Me Too movement has been a sort of first step into this culture that is supposed to happen at some point in full.
Yes, the Me Too movement was
women, some women advocating and telling about their past experience, negative experiences, and other women starting to report what happened to them as well. So it might be considered a step into this change. What do you think?
Yes, I mean the Me Too movement undoubtedly it was unprecedented. The sheer volume of disclosures from all over the world, because of course it started with the Harvey Weinstein sex scandal, and many women started, originally they were actresses, but then people in the film industry, and then of course it went completely viral. And literally millions and millions of women and people all over the world, because again it's important to emphasize that sexual harassment and sexual offenses occur. Everybody can be a victim. But what it was significant is the sheer volume of disclosure that had never happened. And this also the Me Too movement helped not only to put this on the map, but also to encourage millions of people who would not have otherwise what I call the silent, and actually the Times magazines in 2017 named them people, the person of the year, the silent breakers, they call it them, people who have been silent for many years. And suddenly they had a voice, and they had a collective voice. And you may recall the case of Zelda Perkins. Zelda Perkins, she was an assistant, a production assistant of Harvey Weinstein, and she left in the late 1990s. She was a young woman working for him, but she left because, again, relentless sexual harassment and so forth. With a friend of hers, another colleague, who accused him of attempted rape at the Venice Film Festival. But she remained silent for many years because they both signed non-disclosure agreements. And it took her almost 20 years to finally, in 2017, to speak about this. She was the first one who broke the terms of her non-disclosure agreement. And she told her story. And this has encouraged many women to talk about their experiences. And this is what we've seen in the UK Parliament. In a sense, it was only a matter of time before we started to hear about MPs, because it's so endemic in every area of the labour market. So Me Too has been very important in raising the issue to a global level, something we haven't seen before. But there are also downsides to Me Too, because there is an emphasis on disclosure, and that's not necessarily something that may be suitable for everybody. So you have victims who do not wish to disclose for very good reasons. But nevertheless, Me Too has been important in raising the bar, and certainly we've seen, as I said, for instance, the independent complaints and grievance procedure, the scheme that came out as a result and as a byproduct, as it were, of the Me Too movement. So it's been very important, but there are, of course, as well, advantages and disadvantages. But overall, I would say that yes, Me Too has been fundamental in raising the issue and encouraging people to disclose, and organizations to be more responsive to the needs of sexual harassment victims, and to in a sense to clean their acts. But yeah, there's a long way to go still.
I had a question that I've always been curious about. How would you define, how would you classify a particular action as sexual harassment? How do you set the boundaries? I don't think it's always so clear. Obviously, some cases are, but not they're all the same. So there might be cases when, as a woman, you wonder, okay, how should I conduct this action or this word or this approach or this attitude by this man, this colleague, or by my boss, etc., etc.
It's again, it's a $1 million question. So we do have the law and we have equalities law.
Is that an
yes and no. I was to say yes and no. So we do have, as I say, equalities law who describe and European laws, international treaties who describe sexual harassment in certain ways. But then you have organizational policies and procedures who may list what it means by sexual harassment, and you have things like, for instance, I don't know, a particular sexist comment, and of course, physical, inappropriate behavior. So you have also the idea of how you use language. For instance, making passes at somebody, invading somebody's personal space, but in a kind of sexual manner, forcing people to do things that they don't want to. And if you look at I'm just thinking of the book, the accounts by the survivors, and there was a particular Lucy. She was a particular again parliamentary assistant. She was working for an MP, and he was making sexual comments day in day out. He was talking to her about even drinks that have a certain shape, that it was in a sexual way. He told her about his personal sexual desires, and all these kinds of things, they qualify as sexual harassment. But the problem with sexual harassment, like with any other, and of course any kind of like physical, assaults and so forth. But the problem with sexual harassment and definitions of sexual harassment, despite of the law and the criteria that we have, is that it also boils down to interpretation. How do you? It's very difficult ultimately, because it's about human interaction. So obviously somebody.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking. Yeah, and it's also, can it be also subjective to each perceives something in a different way, somebody else. So yeah, that's my question. It's like you don't have necessarily always the same perception, or you can't really use always the same criteria, because we are different people, the three of us. We are three women, we are all different, and something that might be perceived by me as very like a sexual thing might not be perceived, for example. I don't know.
Yeah, as I say, you do have equalities law that very clearly defines certain types of behavior, but then you have the gray area of interpretation. What do you mean by the language that you use, for instance, or your physical approach to somebody, or the idea of making a pass at somebody? What do you mean by that? I remember in the case of Mark Garnier, he called his assistant, and excuse the language, sugar tits. He thought it was funny. He thought it was hilarious that there was no sexual harassment. She thought that this was sexual harassment because it was a direct and derogative way of objectivizing her, and it was language. He just basically called her something quite offensive, but he didn't think that any of that. So again, there is, as I said, we have the legal criteria, but we also have interpretation. And again, when you look at and this comes across in the book and in the research, time and time again, we will have different interpretations of what took place between two people, particularly if it's of an offer of intimate nature. And that's where when you have even rape cases, the idea of consent. Was she consenting? Was she not consented? Discussed. And it's very, very difficult because it's about human interaction. But so the law tries to protect victims by having obviously criteria, but at the same time there is always that gray area in terms of interpretation. And there is a lot of victim blaming. She shouldn't have done. It's always putting the emphasis on women. She shouldn't have been wearing the skirt.
She should have behaved differently. She should have talked differently.
But these organizations, when they put down when they describe harassment, they base it on the law, or they are their interpretation on the law.
Sorry, just spill the water. Yes. Of course, most organizations they follow the criteria, but they also have their own policies and procedures. So they may be explaining perhaps further, because you have to think that they're very different working environments. So certain behaviors may be more prone in some places than others. But yes, typically they will look at criteria. But interestingly as well, you do have different definitions of, for instance, the idea of rape. It has to be penetration by with a penis, or it has to be It could be any different type of penetration with something else. So you still have as well, even within the legal framework, different types of understandings, and certainly in different legal systems you see this of what a particular sexual act and a particular offense means, and what it takes to describe and to qualify. So then you get into the legal, into the legal field. But from the point of view of organizations, the important thing, as I say, is to try to follow the law, but to give victims a fair access to systems, robust systems that help them. So if you feel that somebody is sexually harassing you, you should be able to feel that you have robust mechanisms that are going to help you. And then, of course, there is a due process, because perhaps it wasn't sexual harassment. Perhaps you were oversensitive, and somebody maybe was just have a different perception or idea or use of language. But then you get into these gray areas. But fundamentally, what we're seeing here is organizations failing victims of sexual harassment because they don't provide, and sometimes clarity as to what sexual harassment entails, or sexual offenses. And the other thing is to provide victims with access, and those who made allegations, because remember, to start with their allegations, this has to be proved. It has to be proven in court or in some kind of inquiry, investigation. But somebody's alleging that somebody has done this to them, and therefore you need to have robust mechanisms, and usually they're not there.
And they also, one of the things that we don't talk about that much, it's the emotional and psychological scars that these people suffer because of this. And there are no, I have the feeling that there are no mechanisms to help them if they are only like their own mechanisms to reach out to a psychologist, but it's always paid by the victim. I don't see in the global view many mechanisms to help the victims deal with these kind of scars and the emotional and psychological scars. So yes,
yes, and that's a really interesting point. Sorry, I was just looking at some. We were talking about the legal instruments, and in the UK, for instance, and I'll come back to that. We have the UK Equality Act 2010, which describes sexual harassment as unwanted conduct of sexual nature. And then you have the EU's Equality Treatment Directive that looks at the idea of, again, unwanted verbal, non-verbal, physical conduct of a sexual nature, da 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 da. And then we have the United Nations Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which gets more, discussion as to what the term violence against women means, and so forth. So you have all these different instruments, legal instruments, that actually tell you what sexual harassment is. And let's put some examples here to help you. Again, this is from the book. Groping, inappropriate touching, using sexual overtones, sending improper text messages. We have quite a few MPs who actually were sexting and sending sex messages to young women who typically wanted to work for them. So again, you see the whole issue of authority and power. Making unwanted passes, making misogynistic comments. But of course, what is a misogynistic comment? Discuss. Initiating sexual chatter, pressurizing individuals into unwelcome sexual behavior. And these are just some of the practices that I cataloged in the book from all the research and the media exposure of the MPs, getting into this kind of behavior. But as I said earlier, in most cases, the dispute is that this was any type of sexual behavior at all, or any type of sexual harassment. And sorry, the question that you make, remind me, it was about
mechanisms to help victims with
yes.
with healing the emotional and psychological scars. Yeah.
Again, there is research that shows that many of the impact that people experience as a result of sexual harassment, and of course it varies tremendously from it's a whole variety of the consequences of this. So first of all, anxiety, many people, depressions, all sorts of mental health issues, because of course if you're many people simply cannot afford to lose their jobs, and therefore, or even look for another job. So if that's their livelihood, and they are constantly every day being subjected to sexual harassment by their bosses typically, or colleagues, this has a devastating impact on their self-esteem, on them psychologically. Many of them become perhaps withdrawn. There is a whole range of short, medium, and long-term effects of sexual harassment at work and workplace offenses on individuals. And yes, indeed, if organizations are not even providing robust HR systems to help them make complaints and for whistleblowers to blow the whistle, so imagine the little help that exists for victims, either within the workplace or once they leave the workplace, and they pretty much left to sink or swim. And that again, it's a huge problem, because there are huge implications for people who are constantly subjected to this type of behavior day in, day out.
And Christina, sorry, there was something I wanted to ask about. You quickly mentioned at the very beginning about NDAs, which get signed off. So can you tell us about that a bit more in detail?
Yeah,
that's very curious.
Yes, so
NDAs, proper NDAs.
NDAs, so they are non-disclosure agreements. Now, these are legal. Yes?
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So NDAs, these are non-disclosure agreements. These are perfectly legal instruments that are used. They are confidentiality agreements. It is like a legal contract. And they are used perfectly legally in commercial deals, business transactions, when the parties involved want to keep secret and confidential, rather, certain details. So think, for instance, that they can be used legitimately to protect entrepreneurial ideas, intellectual property, dealings with partners, with suppliers, investors. So they have perfectly legal uses, and that's all good. The problem is that NDAs have become the common way of dealing with cases of sexual harassment, discrimination at work, and abuse at work, and therefore this is an unethical use of non-disclosure agreements. And this is what we've seen not only in Parliament, but in the case of Harry Weinstein sex scandal. And I mentioned Stella Perkin. Again, what happened here is that the victims of workplace sexual harassment, then they are paid to be quiet. So basically, they are keeping them silent. So what they're doing is that rather than helping them to progress with their claims and seek accountability and justice, they're basically being paid to be silent. They're being silent. And this, of course, occurs in victims of sexual harassment at work. And, you have plenty. As I say, Stella Perkins is one example. Rose McGowan, one of the actresses that has been a campaigner for the Me Too movement. She also signed an NDA agreement. Recently, we have an interesting case, of course, with the Epstein scandal. You remember Virginia Giuffre and the infamous case of the Duke of York. Virginia Giuffre, she was a sexual harassment victim, sexual assault victim of sexual human trafficking and rape and all sorts. And she signed a non-disclosure agreement to silence her. And usually the figures are quite substantial in some cases. Philip Green, if you remember, Sir Philip Green, he also, the retail tycoon, he also had some employees that accused him of all sorts of misconduct, signing non-disclosure agreements to keep them quiet. He went as far as to try to obtain a temporary injunction with the Daily Telegraph the Telegraph newspaper, because they wanted to reveal the story. But eventually he was outed in Parliament by Lord Peter Haines on public interest grounds. So we know that he has done that, and they've been used and abused right, left, and center. Broadcasting media is a huge area, and the business sector where these non-disclosure agreements are being signed. And the problem is that it silences victims of workplace misconduct and sexual harassment. It prevents them from reporting crimes and also discourages them from reporting. And ultimately, one of the things that they don't do is to address the perpetrator's behavior, because they get away with it. So basically, they're powerful. They can throw money at victims. Victims will have to be quiet. They can't disclose anything. and they in a sense they wash their hands. And in the case, just to give you some information in terms of Zelda Perkin, they can be very punitive. So the non-disclosure agreement that she signed did not allow her to speak to anybody. So for 20 years, she couldn't talk to anybody about what happened, not even a therapist or a counselor about the trauma that she experienced. So she had not to say anything to anybody. She didn't even get a copy of her NDA. So she couldn't even have a physical copy of what she had signed. And it was extremely punitive. She described the whole process as traumatic. And indeed, it's an abuse of power by organizations, in this case, the Weinstein Company. And they're not helping anybody by themselves, because the victims literally are silenced. Nothing has happened. They can't talk. The perpetrators do not get any liability, i.e. that by signing a non-disclosure agreement, typically that means that they don't have to acknowledge anything wrong happened. Basically, that's whatever happened, it was resolved. They agreed to this particular course of action, and they are very unethical. And this is something the government is trying to do. We have an NDA bill going through Parliament to try to regulate them, because they are being abused right, left, and center. So this is a way in which organizations.
Would you say spread?
Oh yeah.
Would you say it's a very widespread policy? These legal NDAs. Obviously, I'm very familiar with the legal ones. But I wasn't aware of the existence of this type of NDAs.
They are legal. This is the problem. They are legal, but they are unethical. So it's an unethical use. Totally legal. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the government is trying to do, to regulate the NDA. In the US, it has become a cottage industry, and is the de facto way in which many of these disputes are resolved by non-disclosure agreements. And this is something that came up in the public arena as a result of the Harvey Weinstein's case, because he used non-disclosure agreements to silence his rape and sexual assault victims. But it is legal. It's just unethical. It's a misuse of a legal instrument. Wow, I know.
Wow, yeah. So much to do, really. So much to do. Hannah, I'm conscious about the time. Anna, do you have any questions?
Not questions. I want to thank Christina, because it was like a real eye opener, because I know the context in Portugal. It's where I live. I was a little bit unaware of the dimensions in a global perspective, but I think what I take it from this conversation, it's the legal side can be different from country to country, but the culture is there. So, yeah. So,
totally.
What about you, Tiziana? What do you take most about this conversation?
Well, some of the numbers that have been mentioned, the 26% of female representatives in parliaments, rather than the 150 years that are needed to close the current gender gap. This is so gross, really. And probably this cultural aspect, which sits behind basically everything, all the issue, and the fact that, like the NDAs, there are still some legal assets which are legally utilized by many organizations globally, even if they are completely unethical. And this is one of the cases. I mean, I was there, as I said, so I'm kind of shocked to find out about this, really.
I just say, so, by the way, this is the World Economic Forum. It's 145.5 years, but it's still very, very close to 150. But yes, I think that for me, having done the research, I found them both fascinating on the one hand, but at the same time, it's horrifying when you look at the extent of the problem. It is endemic, and also it's not just in parliaments, but it cut across every single industry. I think it's a reflection of the power gender gap and the fact that we still, as I was saying earlier, we need more diversity, we need more women, we need to narrow that gender gap, and we need a change of cultures and attitudes toward women working, but also women in positions of authority, as well as the abuse of power in organizational settings. And we need organizational structures that protects the victim, not become complicit in these crimes. And yes, the NDA is a real battle, and it's something that the government is trying to do something about it. And I'd like to end up on a positive note, because I have been inspired by the courage of survivors of sexual abuse, sexual harassment at work. They've been so brave, coming up, telling their stories, often at very personal, high personal cost to their careers, to their, even their families. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, and it's so important that we speak up. But nobody should be forced to speak up. That's also important to consider, that it may not be for everybody. And maybe for some women, the brave thing to do is, to be quiet, and that's fine. So everybody's different, but it's important to raise these issues. That is for sure, and we need to do that, because by raising the issues, they have visibility, and therefore we can do something about it. But I'm very optimistic about the future. I think that as more women come into the labor market, they also, climb the organizational ladders. That we can address these issues, and we can look forward to a more equitable workforce, and to do away with some of these attitudes which are really outdated in the 21st century.
Thanks, Christina. It's been really precious and rich. And thanks for your insights, for your telling us about your case studies, and telling us about your book. Let's keep these conversations alive and kicking, really, because it's very important, I believe. And I guess it's time for now. So thank you again. Really appreciate that. And goodbye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay tuned for next week, where we'll discuss sex education in museums. Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team: Catarina Caldeira,
Tiziana, Ruberto,
Laura Staffie.